Aramco, 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 Aramco. And yeah, I started to have problems whilst reading that out, like a kind of tongue twister. Hey there, folks. Welcome to a video where I'm going to be talking about Saudi Aramco, F1's newest, seemingly, sponsorship in the world of petrochemicals. Now, they started sponsoring Formula 1 in terms of being like title sponsors of races with Hungary 2020. So if you want to build up this kind of narrative that everything bad happened in 2020 and you think that the involvement of Saudi Aramco is bad, you could probably tie it to that. In 2020, they sponsored 3 Grand Prix. In 2021, they sponsored 3 as well, but they also had prevalent sponsorship at tracks typically outside of the Middle East and also sponsored testing. They currently slated to sponsor the preseason test in Bahrain, as well as the United States Grand Prix at the Circuit of the Americas, though most title sponsors for this season in F1 haven't been announced. And it's not something we really pay attention to. I mean, you might have forgotten that, for example, one of the ones that was sponsored in 2020 was the Eiffel Grand Prix at the Nürburgring. But title sponsorships is something that is a lot more prevalent in somewhere like NASCAR, where you have, for example, the Busch Clash. So that's the race going on today. It's the Clash, but it's sponsored by Busch, the beer. And it's something that's happening more and more in F1. It happened in the past, but we only really didn't pay much attention because it was things like Rolex, which is the timing partner of F1. Aramco is actually a partner of F1, but we didn't pay so much attention to it. I feel like a lot of people are now, largely because it's a conversation we're having more and more, especially with 2020 having been, well, 2020. But petrochemical involvement, and in particular the same kind of way as Aramco, isn't really that new to F1. And let me start off by painting you a picture. We have 10 teams in F1. 8 of them have some kind of deal with some kind of petrochemical company. Mercedes have Petronas. Red Bull have Mobil 1 of ExxonMobil. Ferrari have Royal Dutch Shell, which I would make a tax joke about, given, Ferrari's registered in the Netherlands, but Shell's actually somehow registered in the UK now. McLaren have Gulf Oil, which is a weird kind of... It's not the actual Gulf Oil, it's more a distributor of other petrochemicals. They formerly had Petrobras, which is a Brazilian state-owned company. Alpine have had British Petroleum, which is British, but it's not actually a state-owned company. Aston have got Aramco now, because they're now the Aston Martin and Aramco Competition Formula 1 team. Alfa Romeo have Orlen, the people who tend to sponsor people like Robert Kubica. They're a Polish petrochemical company. And Haas have Uralkali, who most people might recognise as the reason why the driver that finished 21st in the 20-car championship is on the grid, but they are actually a petrochemical company. And I mentioned state ownership. Saudi Aramco is a state-owned company, which we'll get onto in a second. But at the same time, so are Petronas, and so are Petrobras, who, of course, are no longer involved with McLaren, but have been in the past. And you go back through the history of F1, you'll find all of these other kinds of sponsorships and deals that do similar things. Now, why is there this conversation about Saudi Aramco? It feeds into a lot more narratives. And this is going to be a long video because I need to talk about them a bit. The Saudi Aramco problem tends to be the problem of the Saudi state being involved. Lots of people aren't particularly keen on Saudi Arabia for a lot of reasons. In fact, it's the same reasons a lot of people aren't keen with many states in the Middle East, except Saudi Arabia is just the newest to exercise these kinds of wants to be involved in wider sports and culture. There's a concept called sports washing. It's also known as culture washing, but it's essentially holding major cultural events in countries that have got dubious records on things such as human rights. Saudi Arabia has been the most recent high-profile case of this. WWE was there. You've got the Formula E season opener being there the past few seasons. You've got the Dakar being there. In fact, the Dakar had something that stood out, but Formula E had a similar kind of thing, but I'll talk about that in a moment, and of course Formula 1. Now, Saudi Arabia's recent records include women not being allowed to drive, something that was only overturned a handful of years ago. And they had a couple of publicity stunts to promote the fact that they allowed women to drive, which, would be seen as kind of a basic right in a lot of other countries, such as at the Formula E Prix. They had a test day for women to go around a track, to go, look, this is a good thing we're doing. The Dakar, I believe, last year, drove past a prison that held a lot of the activists who campaigned for women's right to drive, who were still in prison, despite the fact that the law has changed. And this isn't something that's new to Saudi Arabia. It's not something that's new to the Middle East. It's not something that's new to Formula 1. We'll get onto that in a moment, so put a pin in that. Because what I want to also point out is that, Petronas is state-owned. They sponsor Mercedes. And if you look at other petrochemical companies, ExxonMobil, Dutch Shell, BP, you'll find very dubious human rights records. In some cases being alleged to having been found to support violent attacks on people who seemed to potentially negatively impact their operations in the country. It's a long-winded way of saying, essentially, they may or may not have caused the deaths of people for profit in violent clashes, some of which military. Which again is nothing new to petrochemicals or oil. It's nothing new. And part of the reason why we're talking about it with Saudi Aramco and Saudi Arabia is because we are more conscious of it today. Part of it is also because of an unconscious bias that a lot of people have, especially talking about places like the Middle East, majority Muslim countries, countries which claim to be states where the state religion is Islam. And there are wider criticisms of Saudi Arabia which are then tied to this. But this is not the video to talk about that. So this is a video to say that when I did videos criticising other races that F1 had in dubious places, the one that got the most support was Saudi Arabia. People were more annoyed that I was saying bad things about the United States, bad things about the UK, bad things about Hungary. But they were okay with me saying it about Saudi Arabia. So let's go back to talk about the Middle East. And we've nearly gone on for 10 minutes. I promise this will end soon. Hopefully we're past the halfway point. You might have remembered earlier in the video I said that Aramco's sponsorship exists largely outside of Middle Eastern tracks. That's because there are so many international tensions between other Middle Eastern states. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain. Some of them are more close connections. Some of them it's largely just diplomatic. But there are ongoing international tensions. And F1 plays into it by going, they're going to give us money so we can go to races here. Because, it's that statement, isn't it? Cash is king. It's more that power is king. And cash is an extension of that power. But it's a way of being able to say, actually, these regimes supposedly aren't so bad because they can host F1 races. Which is exactly what sports washing is. That's exactly what we're talking about here with sports washing and culture washing. The question is now, where do we go from here? Because we can talk about the fact that it could avoid conflict, but the Golden Hoops era ended in the 90s, a theory that said that McDonald's stores, McDonald's restaurants, if a McDonald's restaurant was in a country, it would not go to all of another country than a McDonald's restaurant, which was wrong. This idea that it's going to keep the peace in the Middle East, I believe, is also wrong. Because, well, power talks. Cash is an extension of it, but it's not the only extension of power. Is F1 resistant to change? Maybe. At the end of the day, WRC only went hybrid this year, but they've already gotten sustainable biofuels, providing all of the teams. As in, literally all of the teams. And all of the people on the WRC billing are propelled by biofuel to be more environmentally sustainable, which F1 is not doing because, well, 8 out of the 10 teams are sponsored by petrochemical companies. These companies are pivoting more towards electric propulsion, but that's not in terms of stopping fossil fuel production. That's in terms of also doing electric because they can get more money. They can get more money if they have charging stations at their stations. If they have a charging point, you can get people to pay to charge up their EV. Happy days! And it's where F1 lags behind. F1 is still going to be powered by oil or oil companies for, well, forever. Because there's so much money that's made in it. Cash is king in a lot of places in F1 because, well, the teams needed to stay afloat. So, I don't see any changes happening soon, regardless of any kind of actions. All we could do, or all I want to do, is just stand on a soapbox and say, this is not something I agree with. Which is something I've done for ages. And it's always hard for me to grapple with in terms of my conscience. So on the one hand, I'm like, these companies are obviously fueling, no pun intended, the way the world's going. But at the same time, I want to follow this sport. I don't follow it because of that. But you can't have somewhere that's free of politics. I know a lot of people try to disconnect it, but everything's political. It goes down to the food you eat, the clothes you're wearing. I mean, I'm not wearing something that's branded, for example, for part of that reason. It's the way the world is. And that's a very low note to end on, isn't it? The idea that this is the way the world is. We can say what we will, but we're probably not going to change anything. I mean, look at me, I've sat here for nearly 15 minutes talking about these kinds of issues, but I haven't talked about any solutions because there are no solutions that we can make. But I want to end with this one particular note. And this is going to be a really weird one. Sponsorship from Saudi Arabia is nothing new in F1. In fact, Saudi Airlines sponsored Williams. Way back. And Williams have had their fair share of petrochemical sponsors in the past. The only reason why AlphaTauri doesn't is because it's a Red Bull owned team. So by extension, as ExxonMobil. As annoying as it might be, it's part of the nature of F1. It's not something that we have to agree with. It's something that we can challenge if we want. But we have to understand it's where F1 is. And yeah, I still enjoy it as a sport. Doesn't mean I won't criticise it for things like this. I'd urge you, if you feel the same way, to do so too. Thank you for watching. I'll see you around. Bye for now.